The glass shattered before anyone screamed a sharp crack, slicing through the hotel lobby like a gunshot, and every head turned just in time to see the old man collapse beside the marble concierge desk, his cane skittering across the floor, his mouth opening and closing in soundless panic. People froze. Not because they did not care, but because no one knew what to do fast enough. The chandelier lights hummed. A bellhop swore under his breath. Someone whispered, "Call security." Someone else said, "Is he drunk?" The front desk clerk leaned forward. Flustered voice raised words, useless. The man on the floor did not hear any of it. He was deaf, and his heart was failing. Laura Bennett saw all of this from behind a housekeeping cart streaked with disinfectant and chipped paint parked just inside the service corridor, where the carpet changed color and the air smelled faintly of bleach and burned coffee. She did not rush forward. She did not shout. Her body locked in place as if memory itself had reached out and grabbed her by the spine. 41 years old. That was how long Laura had lived, learning when to stay still. The soundless scream on the man's face dragged her backward through time to a cramped kitchen in South Boston, to a linoleum floor slick with spilled water, to her mother's hands, shaking in the air, forming signs no one bothered to understand. Laura's chest tightened. Her fingers curled against the metal handle of the cart. In the lobby, the old man's hand twitched. His eyes rolled back. Someone finally shouted for an ambulance. Too late. Or almost. Laura moved. She crossed the polished floor with quick, measured steps, her shoes barely making a sound. She knelt beside him, ignored the startled looks, ignored the manager rushing toward her with a face already forming an apology. Laura lifted her hands into the man's line of sight and signed fast, clear, deliberate. "Stay with me. Breathe. Help is coming." The man's eyes snapped back into focus. He locked onto her hands like they were a rope thrown to a drowning swimmer. His breathing stuttered, then slowed. A thin sound escaped his throat, half sob, half relief. Only then did the room seem to exhale. No one thanked her. Not yet. The security guard crouched, in suddenly authoritative. The front desk clerk stepped back, embarrassed. The manager straightened his tie and glanced around, as if checking whether anyone important had seen this interruption to the hotel's perfect morning rhythm. Someone had. From the mezzanine balcony above the lobby, a tall man in a charcoal overcoat stood perfectly still, one hand resting on the railing, his coffee untouched beside him. His hair was silver at the temples, his posture straight, in the way of men who had spent their lives refusing to bend. He had watched the entire thing without blinking. When Laura signed, his fingers twitched involuntarily at his side. Not recognition. Something sharper. He turned away before anyone noticed him watching. Laura did not see him. She was already backing away, disappearing toward the service hall before questions could land. She returned to invisibility the way some people return to prayer. Habitual. Necessary. Housekeeping policy was clear. Do not engage guests unless instructed. Do not interrupt operations. Do not draw attention. Diane Cole had made sure of that. Diane was the kind of supervisor who never raised her voice because she never had to. Her authority lived in looks, clipped sentences, and the quiet power of schedules that could be changed without explanation. 10 minutes later, Diane found Laura by the linen room, hands on hips, lipstick-perfect eyes flat. "You were not assigned to the lobby," she said. Laura kept folding towels. White, crisp, military corners. "There was a medical issue. That is not your call." Diane leaned closer, lowering her voice. "We have procedures. You don't freelance here." Laura nodded once. She did not argue. She had learned long ago that explanations invited punishment. Diane watched her for a moment longer, then walked away, heels clicking like a metronome marking time. Laura never seemed to catch up to. The hotel settled back into its expensive quiet. Guests checked in. Elevators chimed. The incident became a story told badly, over coffee, and forgotten by noon. But not by everyone. In a private conference suite on the 14th floor, Thomas Reed paced beside a wall of windows, overlooking the Charles River phone pressed to his ear, voice tight with irritation. "I don't care if the guest recovered," he snapped. "I care that it happened in the lobby. That's exposure." He stopped pacing, listened, then smiled thinly. "Handle it, and make sure it doesn't make it into the morning report." Across the room, Richard Coleman sat in a leather chair that cost more than Laura made in a year. His expression unreadable. He had not spoken since Thomas walked in. He watched the city toggle between gray water and steel sky, watched his own reflection in the glass. 62 years old, still haunted by things that did not leave marks. Thomas ended the call and turned. "We'll need to tighten floor protocols, and housekeeping needs a reminder about boundaries." Richard said nothing. His mind was not on protocols. It was on hands. On the way, Laura's fingers had moved with urgency and restraint. On how familiar that language felt in his bones. That night, Laura cleaned the executive floors alone. Vacuum hum low. Lights dimmed. The hotel took on a different face after midnight, less polished, more honest. She wiped fingerprints from doors she would never enter. She passed framed photographs of smiling men cutting ribbons, shaking hands, celebrating milestones she had helped maintain without ever being named. Near the corner suite, she paused. Voices drifted through the door. Men's voices. Controlled. Dangerous in their calm. Laura did not mean to listen. She never did. But her name floated out unmistakable. She crossed a line Thomas Reed was saying. "If we let that slide, we set a precedent." Another voice answered. "Lower. Slower. Richards." She prevented a fatality. A beat. Then Thomas again, sharper now. "She exposed us. If that guest's family asks questions, if anyone files a complaint, we're looking at scrutiny we don't need. Especially now." Laura's heart thudded. She should leave. Her feet did not move. Silence stretched inside the room, thick and heavy. Then Richard spoke again, quieter. "I want to understand what she saw." Thomas laughed once, humorless. "She's a cleaner. What she saw is not the point." Laura's breath caught. The word cleaner landed like a verdict. Inside the suite, a chair scraped. Thomas's tone dropped into something intimate and threatening. "You know what's at stake, Richard. The board doesn't forgive surprises, and neither do our insurers." Laura felt it then, the shift in the air, the same feeling she had felt as a teenager standing outside her mother's bedroom door, knowing something was wrong, knowing that speaking up would change everything. She raised her hands without thinking, signing to herself in the narrow hallway, a nervous habit she had never broken. Danger. Silence. Wrong. The door opened. Thomas Reed stepped out, nearly colliding with her. His eyes flicked to her hands mid-motion, then to her face. Recognition sparked not of language, but of risk. "How long have you been standing there?" he asked. Laura froze. Her voice vanished. Behind him, Richard Coleman appeared in the doorway. Their eyes met. Laura's fingers moved again, small, urgent, unmistakable. "Danger. Please. Don't speak." Richard's breath hitched. Down the hall, an elevator chimed. Somewhere far below, the city kept moving, unaware that something irreversible had just been set in motion. Richard Coleman did not speak. That alone changed the temperature of the hallway. Thomas Reed waited for him to say something sharp, corrective, managerial. Instead, Richard's eyes stayed on Laura's hands, still lifted fingers trembling just enough to betray how much effort it took to keep them steady. Thomas followed his gaze and smiled thin and controlled. "She's been eavesdropping," he said, already shaping the narrative. "That's a violation. Grounds for immediate termination." Laura lowered her hands slowly. Her pulse hammered so loudly she was sure they could hear it. She opened her mouth and nothing came out. Not fear exactly, something older, something that had learned long ago that words could make things worse. "She was assigned to this floor," Richard said at last. His voice was calm, but there was a strain beneath it, like metal bent too far. Thomas cocked his head. "Cleaning staff aren't assigned to executive meetings." She was cleaning. Richard did not look at Thomas when he said it. He looked at Laura. "Is that right?" Laura nodded once. The hallway lights buzzed faintly overhead. The carpet muffled sound. It felt like the world had shrunk to the three of them and the space between each breath. Thomas stepped aside, angling his body to block the door behind him. "Richard, this isn't about her intent. It's about risk. She heard things she shouldn't have." He lowered his voice, conspiratorial. "We can handle this quietly." Quietly. The word landed heavy. Laura's fingers curled at her sides. She thought of her mother's hands, of the way silence had been framed as kindness, as protection. "No," Richard said. The word was soft, but it cut clean. Thomas's smile flickered. "Excuse me, I said no." Richard straightened his presence, filling the hallway in a way Laura had not noticed before. He turned to her. "Go back to your cart." Thomas's eyes widened a fraction. "You're letting her walk away for now." Laura did not wait to be told twice. She turned and moved down the corridor. Her steps measured her back straight. She did not look back. She knew better than to mistake mercy for safety. She finished her shift in a fog. Every sound made her flinch. Every door felt like it might open to pull her back into that moment. When she clocked out, the sky outside the employee entrance was still dark, the air cold enough to bite. She walked the 3 blocks to the bus stop with her coat pulled tight, her thoughts racing ahead of her. She knew the pattern. A meeting, a conversation, a piece of paper slid across a desk. "Sign this. It's for your own good." The bus arrived late. It always did. By the time Laura reached her apartment, a narrow 1-bedroom above a closed bakery, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it until it stopped. A minute later it buzzed again. She let it go to voicemail. She did not need to hear the words to know what they would say. Across the city, Thomas Reed poured himself a drink he did not need and stared at the skyline as if it might answer him. Richard had never said no to him like that, not in 20 years of building this empire together. He replayed the moment, the look in Richard's eyes. Something had shifted, something dangerous. Thomas picked up his phone and dialed a number marked simply legal. "I want a non-disclosure drafted," he said when the call connected. "Tonight." The next morning, Laura was called into Diane Cole's office before she could finish her first room. Diane sat behind her desk, hands folded, expression already resigned. A man Laura had never seen before sat beside her, suit, immaculate pen poised. "Close the door," Diane said. Laura did. The click echoed louder than it should have. "This is about last night," Diane continued. "You were observed outside an executive suite during a private discussion." "I was cleaning," Laura said. The words came out thin, unused. "That's not the issue." The man in the suit slid a folder across the desk. "What matters is what you may or may not have heard." Laura did not touch it. She looked at Diane. Diane did not look back. "This agreement protects everyone," the man said smoothly. "You receive severance. We receive assurance. Assurance." Silence dressed up as professionalism. "I need time," Laura said. Her heart pounded. Diane finally met her eyes. There was something like regret there, quickly buried. "Take the day," she said. "But don't drag this out." Laura left the office with the folder untouched. In the break room, Helen Moore sat nursing a cup of coffee, her hands wrapped around it like it was the only warm thing left in the world. She looked up as Laura entered and read her face in an instant. "They got to you," Helen said softly. Laura sat beside her, the weight of the morning pressing down. "They want me gone," Helen snorted. "They always do." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Don't sign anything yet." Laura swallowed. "I don't have a lot of choices." Helen's jaw tightened. "You have more than you think." At that moment, Richard Coleman stood in his office staring at the same city from a higher floor, his phone lighting up with missed calls from board members, from Thomas, from people who sensed instability and wanted to contain it. He ignored them all. He replayed Laura's hands in his mind, the urgency, the warning. "Danger. Please, don't speak." For the first time in decades, Richard felt the weight of a decision not as a calculation, but as a reckoning. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had not called in years. "I need an emergency board session," he said when his assistant answered. "And I need compliance reports from the last 5 years. Unedited." In the lobby below, guests checked in unaware. The hotel moved as it always did, polished and precise, but beneath the surface cracks were forming. Laura walked home that afternoon with the folder tucked under her arm, unopened. She stopped at a crosswalk and watched the light change, thinking of all the moments in life where timing decided everything. When she reached her apartment, she set the folder on the table and stared at it until her hands stopped shaking. She did not know what Richard Coleman would choose. She did not know what Thomas Reed was capable of. She only knew one thing with absolute clarity. This time, she would not disappear quietly. The boardroom smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, the kind of sterile cleanliness meant to suggest order even when none existed, and Richard Coleman stood at the head of the long walnut table without sitting, his palms resting flat against the surface, as if grounding himself to something solid. The screen behind him glowed with the first slide of a report no one in that room had ever seen in its entirety. 5 years of internal audits. 5 years of redacted incidents. 5 years of silence disguised as efficiency. Thomas Reed arrived last, as he always did, unhurried jacket buttoned, confidence intact. He took his seat without looking at Richard, nodded to the others, and folded his hands. "This seems sudden," he said lightly. "I wasn't aware we had an emergency." Richard did not answer him. He looked instead at the faces around the table. Men and women in their 60s and 70s, veterans of mergers and lawsuits, people who had survived scandals by learning exactly when to look away. "You were aware," Richard said at last, his voice even. "You just didn't expect me to be." A murmur rippled through the room. Thomas's smile tightened. "If this is about last night," he began, "we've already taken steps to contain that situation." Richard clicked the remote. The screen changed. A timestamp appeared written in stark white letters. A security clip began to play, grainy but clear enough. A hotel hallway. Thomas's voice unmistakable. Words about exposure, about risk, about silence. Someone cleared their throat. Another board member leaned forward, squinting. "You recorded me?" Thomas asked, incredulous, now a crack in the smooth exterior. "No," Richard said. "You recorded yourself. You just never thought anyone would listen." The video ended. The room sat in stunned quiet. Thomas laughed once, sharp and humorless. "This is absurd. You're letting emotion cloud your judgment. We've all made hard calls to protect this company, protect it from whom Richard asked, from the people who work here, from the guests who trust us." A woman at the far end of the table spoke up, her voice low. "Richard, these incidents, some of them involve elderly guests, falls, medical delays." Richard nodded. Covered up, settled quietly, families paid to stay silent. He paused. How many of you knew? No one answered. Thomas leaned back, crossing his arms. You're playing a dangerous game. The board won't back this. Richard looked at him, then truly looked at him, and something in his gaze made Thomas's confidence falter. I'm not asking for backing, Richard said. I'm informing you. Hours later, when the meeting adjourned in chaos and whispered phone calls, Richard stepped into the elevator alone. His phone buzzed relentlessly. He let it. For the first time in years, he felt strangely calm, as if the worst thing had already happened long ago and everything else was just consequence. Across the city, Laura sat at her small kitchen table, the folder still unopened. Sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes in the air. Her hands hovered over the paper, then pulled back. She made herself coffee she did not drink. Her phone rang. Unknown number again. She answered this time. Laura Bennett. A woman's voice said crisp, professional. This is internal compliance for Coleman Hospitality. We need to speak with you. Laura's stomach dropped. About what? About what you heard. There it was. Plain. Unavoidable. Laura closed her eyes. I didn't agree to anything she said. No, the woman replied. You didn't. And that's why we're calling. They met in a small conference room off the lobby glass walls, exposing just enough to make Laura feel like she was on display. Helen Moore waited with her sitting close, her presence steady and deliberate. When the door opened, Richard Coleman stepped in alone. No lawyers, no assistants. Laura stood instinctively. Richard lifted a hand. Please, sit. She did. Her heart hammered. I want to apologize, Richard said. The word felt heavy in the air. For what you were put through. For what you're about to be put through. Laura frowned. I don't understand. Richard met her eyes. You're going to be asked to testify, not just internally, possibly beyond this building. Helen inhaled sharply. Laura's breath caught. Testify against who Richard did not hesitate, against Thomas Reed, and against me. Silence flooded the room. Laura searched his face for calculation and found something else entirely. Weariness. Resolve. Regret. I let things happen I shouldn't have. Richard continued, because it was easier. Because silence felt like control. He paused. You reminded me what that costs. Laura's hands trembled. She folded them in her lap. They're going to come after me, she said quietly. Yes, Richard replied. They already are. As if summoned by the words, Thomas Reed appeared in the lobby beyond the glass. His voice raised, his phone pressed to his ear, his eyes scanning until they landed on the room. On Laura. On Richard. His jaw tightened. Laura saw it then, the real danger. Not the raised voices, or the paperwork, but the way power recoiled when it realized it was being watched. I won't disappear, Laura said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Not this time. Richard nodded once. I was hoping you'd say that. Outside, sirens wailed somewhere distant. Inside the hotel, guests moved through their routines, unaware that the story of the building they trusted was about to be rewritten not by the men who signed checks, but by a woman who had learned the cost of silence and chosen at last to break it. The first subpoena arrived at Laura Bennett's apartment on a Wednesday morning, slipped under the door like something ashamed of itself, the envelope heavy enough that she knew before opening it that there would be no going back. She stood there barefoot on cold tile, staring at her name typed in clean black letters, and felt the old instinct rise fast and sharp. Hide. Delay. Endure. She pressed her palm flat against the paper until the shaking stopped. When she finally opened it, the words blurred, but the meaning was clear. Someone had decided she mattered enough to silence. Down the block, a television in a diner window blared a news ticker. A guest at a luxury hotel hospitalized. Internal investigation launched. Sources say executive leadership under scrutiny. Laura did not stop to read the rest. By noon, the hotel was no longer pretending. Security guards stood where bellhops used to linger. Lawyers moved through the lobby with the confidence of men who expected doors to open before they reached them. Diane Cole avoided Laura entirely, sending a junior supervisor to collect her badge and inform her that she was officially on paid administrative leave pending review. The words were polite. The message was not. Helen Moore found her near the service elevator, clutching her bag too tightly. "They're scared," Helen said, reading the room the way she always had. "That's good." Laura exhaled slowly. "It doesn't feel good." Helen nodded. "It never does." She hesitated, then added, "You should know Thomas Reed's been asking about you." The name landed like a bruise. Laura's jaw tightened. "Asking what? How long you've worked here? Who you talk to? What you're planning?" Helen's voice dropped. "That's not curiosity. That's containment." On the 15th floor, Thomas Reed stood in a glass-walled office that had once belonged to Richard Coleman. His reflection fractured across the city skyline. He had not slept. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from attorneys, from board members, scrambling to distance themselves from reporters circling like birds that smelled blood. "She's the weak link," Thomas said into the phone, his voice clipped. "Not Coleman. The cleaner." A pause. Then, "No. Not yet. Pressure first." He ended the call and stared out at the river. He had spent decades mastering systems, understanding how fear flowed downhill. This was no different. The trick was to make the cost of speaking unbearable. Laura felt that cost almost immediately. A neighbor stopped her in the hallway, eyes sharp with curiosity. "You work at that hotel, right?" he asked. "What really happened?" "I don't know," Laura said, and hated how natural the lie felt. The second subpoena came 2 days later. This one named names. Thomas Reed. Coleman Hospitality. Federal Inquiry. Laura's chest tightened as she read it. She sat at her kitchen table long after the coffee went cold, hands folded, breathing measured. She was not afraid of the truth. She was afraid of being alone with it. Richard Coleman called her that night. Not his assistant, not a lawyer. Him. "I won't pretend this gets easier," he said. His voice sounded older than it had in the boardroom. "But you won't be doing it alone." Laura closed her eyes. "They're already trying to isolate me." "I know." A pause. "They tried with me too." She thought of the man she had seen in the hallway, composed, controlled, and wondered what isolation looked like at the top. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. Richard did not answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. "Because I keep seeing my sister's hands, and because you gave me a chance to choose differently." The deposition was scheduled for Friday. A neutral office building, downtown, beige walls, no windows, designed to strip away context and leave only words. Laura sat across from Thomas Reed for the first time since the hallway. He smiled at her like an old acquaintance. "Ms. Bennett," he said smoothly, "this must all feel very overwhelming." Laura said nothing. She folded her hands on the table, grounding herself in the feel of her own skin. Thomas leaned forward. "I want to help you through this. But I need to understand something. How long have you been pretending not to hear conversations you shouldn't?" Laura met his gaze. "I don't pretend," she said. "I clean." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, gone almost instantly. "You understand the implications of false statements, don't you?" "Yes," Laura replied. "I also understand the implications of silence." The room shifted. Thomas sat back studying her anew. He had underestimated her, not because she was strong in the way he recognized, but because she was not afraid to be still. Outside, Richard waited, pacing a narrow corridor, his hands clenched. He thought of all the meetings he had walked into, confident all the negotiations where silence had been a tactic. This was different. This was exposure. When Laura emerged pale but steady, he straightened. "Are you okay?" She nodded. "I told the truth." "That's all we can do," Richard said. He meant it now. The story broke wide that evening. Headlines sharpened, names printed, stock prices dipped. Board members issued statements. Thomas Reed released his own calling, the allegations exaggerated, driven by personal vendettas. He did not mention Laura by name. He did not have to. Her phone rang non-stop. Some calls were kind, others were not. Anonymous messages warned her to be careful, to think of her future, to stop before things got worse. She listened to them all, then deleted them. On Sunday afternoon, Helen came over with groceries and stubborn determination. She set bags on the counter and fixed Laura with a look. "You eating?" Laura smiled faintly. "Trying." Helen nodded, satisfied. She sat down heavily. "I testified once," she said, suddenly. "Years ago, about a guest who fell and wasn't found for hours. They buried it. Made me feel small for speaking up." Her eyes glistened. "I don't regret it. I regret not doing it again." Laura reached out, took her hand. "We're doing it now." Helen squeezed back hard. "Yes, we are." Monday morning, federal investigators walked into the hotel unannounced. Guests whispered. Cameras flashed. Diane Cole locked herself in her office. Thomas Reed watched from his window as the building he had helped create turned against him brick by brick. For the first time, silence did not protect him. It exposed him. Laura stood across the street, watching the entrance, her reflection caught in the glass. She looked tired, older. But when she lifted her hands unconsciously, signing a word she had not realized she was forming, it was not fear. It was steady. It was enough. The courtroom was colder than Laura expected, not in temperature but in tone, the kind of chill that came from rules, enforced without mercy, and eyes trained to weigh credibility the way bankers weighed risk. She took her seat at the witness table and kept her hands folded, knuckles pale, breathing slow. Across the aisle, Thomas Reed sat with his legal team posture, immaculate expression, calm enough to be mistaken for confidence. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Wood scraped softly. The room settled. Laura listened as formalities passed over her like distant weather. She focused on the texture of the chair beneath her, the faint smell of paper and disinfectant, the rhythm of her breath. When the clerk spoke her name, it sounded unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone braver. Ms. Bennett, the prosecutor, said, measured, almost gentle. "Please tell the court what you observed on the night of the incident." Laura lifted her chin. She spoke plainly. "About the hallway. About the voices. About the words that mattered." She did not embellish. She did not rush. She let silence work, where it could not, as concealment, but as space for truth to land. When she finished, Thomas's attorney rose with practiced ease. He smiled in a way meant to soothe jurors and unsettle witnesses. "Ms. Bennett, you are not an executive, correct? No. You do not attend strategy meetings. No. You were assigned to clean, not to listen." "I was assigned to clean," Laura said. "I was not assigned to ignore." A murmur rippled through the benches. The attorney tilted his head. "Isn't it true that you have personal reasons for resenting management?" Laura thought of Diane Cole's clipped voice, of schedules changed without explanation, of the way invisibility had been framed as professionalism. "I have reasons to care about safety," she replied. The attorney pressed. "You learned sign language because of a family tragedy, correct?" "Yes." "So you're emotionally invested." Biased. Laura met his gaze. If caring makes me biased, then yes. The judge rapped the gavel once. Counsel! Thomas watched from his chair, jaw tight now. This was not going the way he'd planned. He had expected tears, cracks. He had not expected steadiness. Outside the courtroom, Richard Coleman paced phone silent in his pocket. He had been advised not to attend to keep distance to protect the company's position. He ignored that advice. He stood anyway, listening through the heavy door, hearing Laura's voice carry clear and unafraid. He felt something loosen in his chest, something he had armored for decades. When the recess was called, Laura stepped into the hallway and leaned against the wall, eyes closed. The adrenaline faded, leaving a hollow ache. Helen Moore appeared at her side, pressing a paper cup of water into her hand. You did good, Helen said. No theatrics. Just fact. Laura drank, nodded. They're not done. No, Helen agreed. Neither are we. The afternoon brought another witness, then another. Patterns emerged. Dates. Settlements. Emails written carefully enough to sound legal and mean nothing. The story took shape not as a single bad decision, but as a culture tuned to minimize noise. By evening, news vans lined the street. Commentators speculated. Analysts argued. Stock tickers crawled. Thomas Reed released a second statement sharper than the first, denying wrongdoing and questioning the motives of disgruntled employees. Laura's name was not used. Again, it didn't need to be. That night, Laura returned to her apartment and sat in the dark. The phone buzzed once, then again. She ignored it until the third time when she answered without looking. Ms. Bennett, a voice said, unfamiliar. This is the office of the Attorney General. We'd like to speak with you tomorrow. Her stomach flipped. About what? About expanding the scope. After the call, Laura sat very still. Expanding the scope meant more days like today. More rooms like that courtroom. More pressure. She lifted her hands, letting them move without words, a private language for steadying nerves. Across town, Thomas Reed met with his attorneys late into the night. Papers spread. Strategies drawn. We need leverage, he said, something that changes the calculus. One attorney hesitated. There is the matter of the executive compensation approvals from 8 years ago. Thomas's eyes narrowed. He knew the file. He knew whose name appeared alongside his. He smiled slowly. Then let's remind them who bleeds with me. The next morning, headlines sharpened again. An anonymous source alleged financial improprieties dating back years. Richard Coleman's name appeared in bold. The board convened an emergency session. Calls flooded in. Richard read the article in his kitchen, the coffee untouched. He felt the familiar pull toward control, toward mitigation. He felt it and let it pass. He called his assistant. Schedule me, he said. Public session. By noon, cameras were set. Microphones clustered. Richard stepped forward, the city at his back, and spoke without notes. He acknowledged mistakes. He did not deflect. He did not hide. He did not name Thomas. He did not need to. I am accountable, he said. And I will cooperate fully. Questions flew. He answered what he could. When it was over, he walked away alone. Laura watched the broadcast from a small television in Helen's living room. Helen sat beside her, silent eyes sharp. That took guts, Helen said finally. Laura nodded. It took time. The next deposition was harder. Thomas's attorney introduced documents meant to confuse, to tangle timelines. Laura stuck to what she knew. She did not speculate. She did not guess. When she didn't know, she said so. The room leaned in. At one point, Thomas spoke directly, breaking protocol. You could have stayed quiet, he said, voice low. None of this would touch you. Laura looked at him. Really looked. She saw the calculation, the fear beneath it. Silence touches everyone, she replied. The judge's gavel cracked. That's enough. By the end of the week, the narrative had shifted. Whispers turned to statements. Statements turned to actions. Investigators returned with boxes. Offices were sealed. Emails were subpoenaed. On Friday evening, Laura stood outside the hotel again, the same glass reflecting a different city. Richard joined her, keeping a careful distance. They're moving quickly, he said. She nodded. They should. He hesitated. You don't owe this place anything. Laura considered that. I don't, she said. But I owe myself. Across the street, cameras rolled. Inside the lobby hummed. The building still stood, but its story was changing sentence by sentence, witness by witness. As the lights came on, one by one in the windows above, Laura felt the weight of the week settle into something steadier. Not relief. Resolve. She did not know how this would end. She only knew it would not end quietly. The first arrest did not happen in the courtroom or the boardroom. It happened quietly just after dawn in the underground garage beneath a glass tower where Thomas Reed had parked for years without ever thinking the doors might open for someone else. Laura heard about it from Helen, who called before 8, her voice tight with something like vindication. They took him in, she said. White-collar unit, no cameras, no speeches, just cuffs and a car. Laura closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against the kitchen cabinet. She had imagined this moment 100 times, and none of those versions matched how it felt. There was no rush, no satisfaction. Just a long, slow exhale she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the hallway outside the executive suite. By mid-morning, the hotel lobby was chaos disguised as calm. Guests whispered. Staff avoided eye contact. The marble floors reflected faces drawn thin by fear and curiosity. Federal investigators moved with quiet authority, badges flashed only when necessary, their presence heavy enough to bend conversations mid-sentence. Diane Cole stood near the concierge desk, hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles shone white beneath the makeup she had applied with extra care. When she saw Laura step inside, escorted by a compliance officer, her posture stiffened. "What is she doing here?" Diane asked, the edge back in her voice, brittle now. Laura met her gaze. For the first time, she did not look away. "She's cooperating," the officer said. "You should be doing the same." Diane's mouth opened, then closed. The rules she had enforced for decades were shifting under her feet, and she did not know where to stand anymore. In a conference room stripped of branding and warmth, Laura sat across from 2 investigators and a recorder that hummed softly. They asked about patterns, about who said what, about when she noticed things stopped making sense. Laura answered carefully, choosing precision over drama. She spoke about near misses, about elderly guests left waiting too long for help, about reports that vanished. She spoke about silence as if it were a system, not a feeling. When the questions ended, one investigator leaned back and studied her. "You understand this doesn't end with Mr. Reed," he said. Laura nodded. "I know." Across town, Richard Coleman sat alone in his office. The door closed, the walls bare where photographs had been removed for review. His phone rang once. He ignored it. It rang again. He picked up. "They've frozen my access," he was told. "Interim leadership is being announced." Richard listened, then said simply, "That's appropriate." He ended the call and stared at the empty wall where a framed mission statement had once hung. For years, those words had meant stability. Now they felt like a challenge. He thought of Laura's hands again, the clarity, the restraint. He realized with a jolt that power did not always announce itself with volume. Sometimes it appeared as refusal. The interim CEO was introduced that afternoon in a hastily arranged press conference. Applause was polite. Statements were cautious. No one mentioned Laura Bennett by name, but her presence was felt in every carefully chosen word. Outside, Laura watched from the steps, the sun bright and unforgiving. A reporter broke from the pack and approached her. "Ms. Bennett," he said, voice eager. "Do you feel vindicated?" Laura considered the question. She thought of her mother, of Helen's daughter, of all the names that would never make headlines. "I feel responsible," she said finally. The reporter frowned, not sure how to use that. Laura turned away. That night, Laura returned to the hotel one last time to collect personal items from her locker. The corridors felt different now, stripped of their certainty. In the staff room, a few employees lingered, talking in low voices. When Laura entered, the conversation stopped. A young housekeeper looked at her with something like awe. "Is it true?" she asked. "Did you really stand up to them?" Laura hesitated. "I stood still," she said. "That was enough." Helen met her by the lockers, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "They're offering counseling?" Helen said. "Voluntary. Imagine that." Laura smiled faintly. "About time." As Laura gathered her things, Diane Cole appeared in the doorway. She looked smaller somehow, her authority stripped of its armor. "Laura," she said, the name unfamiliar on her tongue. "I owe you?" She trailed off, unsure how to finish. Laura zipped her bag. "You owe the people who were afraid to speak," she said. "So was I." Diane swallowed. She nodded once. It was not forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. 2 days later, the second arrest came, then the third. Names Laura had never heard before appeared in articles she couldn't bring herself to read. The scope widened just as the investigator had warned. Systems were examined, policies unraveled. Richard Coleman watched it all from a distance, now no longer the face of the company, but still deeply tied to its fate. He met Laura once more briefly in a quiet cafe near the river. No reporters, no lawyers, just two people who had crossed a line neither could uncross. "They're going to ask you to take on a formal role," Richard said, stirring coffee he didn't drink. "Advisory, oversight, something like that." Laura shook her head slowly. "I didn't do this to climb." "I know," Richard said. "That's why they trust you." She considered that. "Trust isn't a position," she said. "It's a responsibility." Richard smiled, a tired curve of the mouth. "You're right." As weeks passed, the city's attention shifted, as it always did. New scandals, new noise. But inside the hotel, something quieter was taking shape. Anonymous reports increased. Safety protocols were rewritten in plain language. Meetings were held where people actually spoke. Not all of it stuck. Not all of it was sincere. Change never was. Laura moved through this new landscape cautiously. She met with investigators, with advocates, with people who wanted her story packaged and sold. She refused most of them. Her story was not a product. It was a warning. One evening, as she walked home under streetlights that flickered like tired stars, Laura lifted her hands and signed to no one in particular. Not danger, not silence. A different word this time. Seen. It did not feel triumphant. It felt necessary. The invitation arrived without ceremony, a single line in Laura Bennett's inbox that carried more weight than any subpoena she had received before attendance requested. Emergency shareholders session, closed doors. She read it twice, then a third time, her thumb hovering over the screen as if it might burn her. This was different from testimony, different from interviews and investigations. This was the room where decisions were not just argued, but sealed. Helen Moore saw her face and did not ask questions. She poured 2 cups of coffee, strong and black, the way she always did when things were about to get hard. "They don't invite people like you unless they're afraid," Helen said. Laura exhaled. "I don't want to be a symbol." Helen slid the mug across the table. Too late. Now the question is, what kind? The conference suite sat on the top floor of a private financial building overlooking the harbor glass walls and steel beams designed to make people feel small while convincing them they were in control. Laura arrived early, dressed plainly, her posture calm even as her pulse climbed. Around her, men in tailored suits spoke in low voices, eyes flicking toward her with curiosity they tried to hide. No one offered her a seat. She took one anyway. The meeting began without pleasantries. Charts appeared, numbers spoken, percentages shifted, losses acknowledged. Trust discussed like a commodity that could be recalculated. An interim chair cleared his throat and finally gestured in Laura's direction. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "you asked to address the room." Every head turned. Laura stood slowly. She did not bring notes. She did not bring slides. She brought memory. "I didn't ask," she said evenly. "I was asked." Just like the guests who trusted this company. Just like the staff who were told to keep quiet. A man near the far end scoffed. Another leaned back, arms crossed. Laura did not look at either of them. She looked at the center of the table, at the space where Richard Coleman used to sit. "You can restructure leadership," she continued. "You can rewrite policies. But if you don't change what silence is worth in this company, you'll be back here again." A woman interrupted. "And what exactly do you propose?" Laura paused. She let the question hang. "That you stop asking who's allowed to speak," she said, "and start asking why they're afraid." The room shifted. Not agreement. Something else. Recognition, maybe, or discomfort. When Laura finished, no one applauded. That was fine. Applause had never meant much to her. As she sat, her phone vibrated once in her pocket. A single message from an unknown number. "He's here." She did not look around. She did not need to. She felt it the way one feels a storm change direction. Outside the glass doors in a corridor usually reserved for security and assistance, Richard Coleman stood waiting. He was not wearing the charcoal overcoat anymore. Just a plain navy jacket, his tie tucked into his pocket. He looked older than Laura remembered. Lighter somehow. "They didn't tell me you were coming," she said when she stepped out. "They didn't want to," Richard replied. His voice was steady. "I insisted." They stood there, the city stretched behind them, the harbor reflecting a gray sky. For a moment, neither spoke. "They're going to ask you to disappear again," Richard said quietly. "Different words, same request." Laura nodded. "I know. And when you don't," he continued, "they'll look for someone else to blame." She met his eyes. "Are you ready for that?" Richard's mouth tightened. "I should have been years ago." Inside the room, voices rose. A vote was being called. Laura could hear the cadence, the formal language of consequence. Richard stepped closer to the door. "There's something you should hear," he said. He opened it without waiting for permission. The room fell silent as he entered. The interim chair stood halfway out of his seat. "Richard, this is not... I know exactly what this is," Richard said, his voice carrying without strain. "It's the moment you decide whether this company changes or just survives." A murmur rippled. Phones came out. Someone whispered. Richard did not look at them. He looked at the table. "You can vote me out," he said. "You already have. But you can't vote out what's already public." He turned, then gesturing toward Laura. "She is not your problem. She is your evidence." The room erupted. Objections. Demands. Richard raised a hand. Not loud. Just certain. "I built this company by controlling risk," he said, "and I nearly destroyed it by confusing control with silence." A board member snapped, "This isn't the time for confession. It's the only time that matters." Richard replied. Laura watched, heart pounding, as something irreversible took shape. This was not a rescue. This was a transfer. Power shedding its armor in real time. The vote proceeded anyway. Numbers called, decisions recorded. When it was done, Richard Coleman was officially removed from any operational authority pending final review. The announcement was clipped. Professional. Richard did not flinch. As the room emptied, Laura remained seated. A few shareholders avoided her gaze. Others studied her as if recalculating. When she stood to leave, the interim chair cleared his throat again. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "we would like to continue this conversation." Laura nodded once. "I'm not going anywhere." Outside reporters had gathered. Cameras swung. Questions shouted. Richard stopped at the top of the steps, the harbor wind tugging at his jacket. "One statement," he said. The noise dipped. "I failed to act when it mattered," Richard said. That failure had consequences. Today, I choose to face them. He turned slightly, indicating Laura without naming her. And I choose to listen. He stepped back. No applause, no music, just the sound of the city resuming its pace. Later, as dusk settled and the building emptied, Laura and Helen sat on a bench overlooking the water. The sky burned orange and gray. "You scared them," Helen said. Laura shook her head. "They scared themselves." Helen smiled. "Same difference." Laura watched the lights flicker on across the harbor. She felt the weight of the day settle into her bones, not exhaustion, but gravity. This was not the end. She could feel it. The real test was coming. Somewhere behind her, a door closed softly. A decision had been made, not just about leadership, about visibility. Laura lifted her hands once more, the motion instinctive, now signing a word she had learned long before she understood its cost. Truth. The call came at 5:40 in the morning, the sky still bruised with night. Laura Bennett's phone vibrating against the nightstand like something alive. She answered without checking the number. "They're moving the vote," a voice said. "Helen's, awake, sharp. They're calling it early. Before the markets open." Laura sat up, the room cold around her. What kind of vote? The kind where they decide whether this stays a scandal or becomes a reckoning. Helen paused. And they're trying to do it without witnesses. By 7, the city had woken to sirens and headlines. Pre-market chatter spiked. Analysts spoke fast hedging language, careful not to sound surprised. Laura dressed in silence, pulling on the plain blazer she had worn since the first subpoena, the fabric holding the memory of rooms where truth had been weighed like contraband. She took the bus across the river, watching faces blur past, wondering how many of them had learned to survive by keeping their heads down. At the hotel, the lobby had been stripped of warmth. No flowers, no music, security checkpoints where there had been smiles. Laura was stopped, credentials checked twice, then waved through with a look that was equal parts apology and fear. Upstairs, the interim leadership had commandeered the largest ballroom, converting it into a war room of folding tables, laptops, cables, and screens pulsing with data. She spotted Richard Coleman near the back, standing alone, hands clasped behind him, gaze fixed on a monitor that showed nothing but a loading bar. He looked smaller than he had on the steps the night before, not diminished but unarmored. When he saw Laura, he inclined his head, a subtle acknowledgement. "They're compressing the agenda," he said when she reached him. "They want to close the door before anyone asks why." Laura scanned the room. Board members murmured in clusters. Lawyers conferred. A compliance officer rubbed his temples as if trying to push a headache back inside his skull. "What happens if they succeed?" she asked. "They announce reforms," Richard said. "Committees. Timelines. Language that sounds like action." He met her eyes. "And then they wait for people to get tired." Laura felt the familiar pull in her chest, the instinct to endure. She set it aside. "Who controls the feed?" Richard blinked. "The feed, the internal broadcast," she said. "Staff channel, the one that goes to every property." He followed her gaze to a bank of screens labeled with city names: Boston, Chicago, San Diego, Miami. He inhaled slowly. Technically, interim leadership. And practically, he said anyone with clearance and nerve. Laura stepped forward before she could second-guess herself. She moved through the room with the same quiet certainty she used to move down service corridors unseen until she wasn't. A young technician looked up as she approached, eyes flicking to her badge. "Ma'am, this area is restricted." Laura leaned in, lowering her voice. "I know," she said. "So is the truth." He hesitated, then glanced over her shoulder. Richard stood a few paces back, saying nothing, his presence doing the work. The technician swallowed. "I can't give you access," he said. "I don't need access," Laura replied. "I need 1 minute." He looked at the clock. He looked at the screens. He made a choice. Across 14 cities, monitors flickered. In break rooms and back offices, in kitchens and loading docks, staff paused as a live feed replaced the usual training loop. Laura stood centered in the frame, the background, a neutral wall, her posture straight, her hands visible. "I'm Laura Bennett," she said. Her voice did not shake. "I work here. Or I did." The ballroom erupted in shouts. A lawyer lunged for the console. "Too late." "I'm not speaking as a representative," Laura continued. "I'm speaking as a witness." She paused, letting the silence stretch not as a weapon, but as an invitation. "If you've ever been told to keep quiet for the good of the company, this is for you." In Chicago, a line cook froze mid-motion. In Miami, a housekeeper leaned closer to the screen. In Boston, Helen Moore watched from the front desk, her breath caught in her throat. "They're about to vote," Laura said. "And they're going to tell you it's over. It's not." Her eyes held the lens. "If you have information about safety, about pressure, about reports that disappeared, now is the time." Hands reached for phones. Messages began to fly. Anonymous forms filled faster than servers could log them. The feed cut abruptly. The room exploded. Voices overlapped. Accusations flew. Security surged forward. Richard stepped between Laura and the nearest guard. "She's done," he said calmly. "So are you." Within minutes, the vote was suspended. Within an hour, it was irrelevant. The flood had started, and no committee could hold it back. By noon, the Attorney General's office released a statement confirming expanded inquiry. By one, interim leadership announced a postponement of all governance changes pending review. By two, Thomas Reed's name appeared again, this time alongside new charges. Laura sat alone on the edge of the ballroom, the adrenaline draining, leaving a bone-deep weariness. Richard approached careful, as if not to startle her. "You changed the math," he said. She shook her head. They did. Outside, reporters pressed against barricades, the air electric with speculation. Inside, the hotel's staff moved with a new kind of noise. Conversations no longer hushed, questions asked out loud. Not all of them were kind. Not all of them were brave. But they were happening. That afternoon, Diane Cole requested a meeting. She sat across from Laura in a small office, hands-folded posture unfamiliar. "I thought silence kept things stable," Diane said. "I was wrong." Laura listened. She did not absolve. She did not condemn. "Stability isn't the same as safety," she said. Diane nodded once. It was a beginning, nothing more. As evening settled, Laura and Helen stood on the steps again, the harbor reflecting a sky scrubbed clean by wind. Helen laughed softly, a sound Laura had never heard from her before. "You know, Helen said they'll try to turn you into a role." Laura watched the water. "I don't want a role." "Good," Helen replied. "Roles end." A notification chimed on Laura's phone. A message from an address she did not recognize, simple and direct. We need you in the room tomorrow. Final session. Laura exhaled. Tomorrow. Always tomorrow. She lifted her hands unconsciously, fingers forming words without sound. Not truth this time. Not danger. Something steadier. Enough. The final session did not feel final at all. It felt like a holding breath, the kind that stretched until your chest ached and you could no longer tell whether relief or collapse would come first. Laura Bennett sat at the long table again. The same room, the same glass walls, but the energy had changed. There was no choreography left. No script anyone trusted. Faces around the table looked tired now. Not performative tiredness, but the kind that came from nights without sleep and mornings without certainty. Coffee cups stood untouched. Phones lay face down, buzzing anyway. Outside, the harbor was flat and gray, the city waiting. The interim chair cleared his throat. "We're here to determine next steps," he said, voice careful. "Operational, legal, cultural. Cultural." The word hung there, awkward and heavy, as if it did not quite belong in a room built for numbers. Laura listened as they spoke. Committees, oversight, external audits, language designed to signal motion without direction. She let them talk. She had learned the power of waiting. When the room circled back to her, the chair nodded. "Ms. Bennett, you asked to speak." Laura stood slowly. She did not look at the screens. She did not look at the lawyers. She looked at the people. "I'm not here to tell you what to build," she said. "You know how to build. I'm here to tell you what breaks." Someone shifted in their seat. "Systems break when silence is rewarded," she continued. "When the cost of speaking is higher than the cost of harm." She paused. "You've seen what happens when that balance tips." A man near the end of the table interjected. "With respect, you're not responsible for fixing this." Laura nodded. "You're right. I'm responsible for not letting it go back to how it was." The room stilled. Richard Coleman watched from a seat against the wall, no longer central, no longer shielded. He had not spoken once. He had not needed to. His presence was a reminder of what power looked like when it stepped aside. A woman on the board spoke next, her voice quieter than the others. "If we commit to what you're describing, there will be fallout. Financial, legal. There already is," Laura said. "The difference is whether it's honest." Silence followed. Not the old kind. This one felt like consideration. The vote was called. One by one, hands lifted. Not unanimously. Enough. The resolution passed. An independent oversight council. Mandatory reporting channels protected by law. No non-disclosure agreements tied to safety concerns. Consequences spelled out, not suggested. It was not perfect. Laura did not expect it to be. Afterward, as the room emptied in fragments, Richard approached her. "They listened," he said quietly. They heard Laura corrected. "Listening takes longer." He smiled faintly. "You taught them where to start." Outside, the press waited. This time, Laura did not step forward. She watched from behind the glass as statements were read and questions deflected. She felt no pull toward the microphones. Her work was not there. By late afternoon, the city began to move on. Traffic thickened. Tour boats cut white lines through the water. The building behind her hummed with the dull sound of reorganization. Laura walked instead to the Riverwalk, the air sharp with salt and cold. She sat on a bench, hands resting in her lap, letting the day settle. Helen Moore joined her without a word, handing over a paper bag that smelled like warm bread. "You eat?" Helen asked. Laura took a piece, nodded. "A little." Helen watched the water. "They'll remember this," she said. "For a while." Laura chewed slowly. "Long enough is all I'm asking." A man approached hesitantly, badge clipped to his coat. One of the investigators. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "we wanted you to know your testimony changed things. Not just here." Laura met his gaze. "Then use it well." He nodded respectful and moved on. As dusk fell, the city lights came on, one by one reflected in the water like scattered answers. Laura lifted her hands without thinking, the motion small, private. Helen noticed. "What's that one?" she asked. "Finished," Laura said softly. Helen smiled. "No," she replied. "That one survived." Laura considered that. Maybe survival was its own kind of ending, or beginning. Her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number, brief and unadorned. "Thank you for choosing to speak. I didn't think anyone would listen." Laura typed back slowly. "I did. And now others will too." She stood stretching stiff legs, feeling the weight of the past weeks settle into something like resolve. Tomorrow would bring new headlines, new arguments, new attempts to smooth rough edges. She could not control that. What she could control was this. She would not go back to being invisible. Not because she wanted to be seen, but because she understood now what happened when people weren't. As she and Helen walked away from the water, the wind picked up, tugging at coats and carrying the low sound of the city breathing. Laura did not look back at the building. She did not need to. The story had already moved beyond it. 6 months later, the hotel lobby no longer smelled like polish and performance. It smelled like coffee that had gone cold because someone forgot. It mattered like rain tracked in on sensible shoes, like a place where people actually worked instead of disappeared. Laura Bennett stood just inside the service corridor, the same threshold where she used to stop, invisible by design. She wore a simple badge, now not executive, not ornamental, but official enough that people nodded when they passed. Not with awe, with recognition. The new signage was subtle. Clear reporting channels, plain language, no legal fog, no smiling slogans promising care while quietly punishing honesty. It wasn't perfect. Laura had never believed in perfect. She believed in friction in systems that resisted harm instead of burying it. A housekeeper approached her hesitantly, young, nervous, her accent still clinging to every word. "Ms. Bennett," she said. "Can I ask you something?" Laura turned fully toward her. "You already did." The woman exhaled, then laughed, relief spilling out. "My supervisor told me to redo a room report. Said the guest fall wasn't serious enough to log." Laura's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with focus. "Did you write what happened?" "Yes." "Then you did your job." Laura met her eyes. "I'll handle the rest." The woman nodded, shoulders lowering, as if she'd been carrying a weight she didn't know she was allowed to put down. She walked away straighter than she'd arrived. From the mezzanine, Helen Moore watched it all. Her hands wrapped around a cup she had reheated twice and forgotten again. 74 years old, still sharp, still standing. When Laura glanced up, Helen lifted her cup in a small salute. Not pride. Approval. Richard Coleman no longer had an office in the building. He didn't want one. His days were quieter now, filled with depositions and accountability meetings that didn't end with applause. He took responsibility where it belonged and didn't pretend that absolution came with paperwork. When he visited the hotel, he walked through the lobby like a guest, not a ruler, and that mattered more than any title he'd lost. They met sometimes, briefly, without ceremony, conversations about what worked and what didn't, about where resistance was forming and where it was cracking. Not friendship, something steadier, mutual recognition between two people who had chosen not to look away when it would have been easier. The investigations continued slower now, deeper. Some names never made headlines. Some settlements never became stories. Change did not arrive like a parade. It arrived like maintenance, unglamorous and constant, the work that only mattered if it kept happening. Laura traveled occasionally, invited into rooms that used to exclude people like her. Not as a spectacle, as a reminder. She spoke plainly. About systems. About fear. About the quiet ways harm learned to hide behind procedure. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. At night she returned to the same apartment above the closed bakery. She had thought about moving. Bigger windows. Better light. She stayed. Roots mattered. The place where you learned to endure was also the place you learned you didn't have to anymore. Some evenings, she sat at the small kitchen table and practiced signing not because she needed to, but because it kept her connected to the language that had saved her long before it saved anyone else. Her mother's hands lived there. So did Helen's daughter. So did all the names that never appeared in reports, but shaped everything that followed. One afternoon, the old man from the lobby returned, walking more slowly now, cane tapping a steady rhythm against the floor. He stopped when he saw Laura, recognition flickering across his face. He lifted his hands and signed, careful, deliberate. "Thank you." Laura signed back, smaller, truer. "You're safe." He smiled, the kind that reached the eyes, and moved on. Not every day felt like that. Some days were heavy. Some days the system pushed back hard enough to make her wonder how much ground had really been gained. On those days, Helen would remind her gently but firmly, "You don't measure change by comfort. You measure it by what can't be hidden anymore." Laura believed that. She believed in what stayed visible. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, she stood again at the edge of the service corridor, watching the lobby move. Staff spoke freely. Guests asked questions without fear of being dismissed, not because the building had changed, but because the rules underneath it had. She lifted her hands once more, the motion no longer instinctive but intentional, signing a word she had learned to live with. Seen. Not heroic, not famous, just present. And if this story meant anything at all, it wasn't about a cleaner or a CEO or a scandal that burned hot and faded. It was about what happens when one person refuses to disappear and another chooses to listen. And a system is forced, however slowly, to adjust to that truth. If you felt that moment, if you've ever watched someone stay silent because the cost of speaking felt too high, take a second to stay with this story. Like, subscribe, comment.